Hello and welcome to today's video where I'll be covering my webcomic process in Clip Studio Paint. In today's video, I'd like to discuss how to develop a comic's line art style using the tools in Clip Studio Paint. Links to additional tutorials, as well as everything mentioned in today's video, will be down in the description below. Continuing from the last video in the series, our next stop on the road to creating a comic style test is line art. You can achieve very different tones for your comic just by tweaking the presentation of its line art. Think about what you want your line art style to convey about the story. What's its genre and personality? I find that a story with a lot of action benefits from thicker, scratchier line art to imply weight and movement, while a story focused on emotional moments tends to benefit from very simple line art that doesn't stand out too much. The same principles can also be applied to color. A bold black outline is very visually striking and conveys power and intensity, while a softly colored outline can help establish a more subtle atmosphere. Using Clip Studio Paint's comic and illustration tools, we can very easily test out different line art styles to settle on the one that suits the project best. One of the easiest ways to test out different line art styles without having to redraw the same lines over and over is to draw using a vector layer. To do this, click this layer button with the cube to create a new vector layer on your canvas. You may notice that vector lines behave a little differently than raster lines. For starters, they can be bent and manipulated directly with the object tool. Similarly, if your hard eraser has the vector eraser setting enabled, erasing intersecting line chunks only takes a single quick motion. Not only does this speed up the line art drawing process, which is ideal for tests like this, but as you'll see in a moment, we now have a very fine level of control over the presentation of our line art. With your line art drawn on a vector layer, you can select the Object tool, then go to the Tool Property panel and change the style of lines using the Brush Shape dropdown. This allows us to swap out the style of brush used without interfering with the shape of what we've already drawn. Back in the Tool Property panel, we have a few other ways to adjust our line art. By adjusting the brush size, all of the line art will be scaled up or down in thickness while still maintaining its shape. We can also change the hardness and basic color of our lines here. If we wanted to do more focused manipulations of the thickness of certain areas, we can use the correct line tools on specific points of our line art to thin or thicken them up. Using the sliders in the Tool Property panel, you can control exactly how much thicker or thinner you'd like the selected area to become. Just use the tool like a lasso, and any line you've selected will have its line weight adjusted accordingly. My recommendation for doing the style test is to make multiple copies of your vector line art layer, then change each one to a different brush style to see what suits the story best. It's important to factor in what brushes you're most comfortable using, and which ones are the easiest to color in and adjust when working on a big project, so I tend to opt for ones I already know I like to use. Finally, I recommend keeping different presets for your background line art and your character line art. Having line art of the same style and thickness between the two can cause your characters to blend in with their surroundings too much. An easy rule to follow is to have your background line art be thinner than your character line art. This ensures your characters stand out the most, and it implies some distance between them and their surrounding objects. Some artists also like to use a more sparse, textured brush for backgrounds, which goes even further to imply some distance and separation. I recommend experimenting to see what you like best. As one final note, another important element to consider is whether or not you want your line art to be colored in, and how. Like I mentioned earlier, the choice of line art color can set the tone just as much as the weight or brush type. To test color options on your line art, you can simply create a new layer above your vector layer and use the clipping mask tool to clip them together. Now, any colors drawn will be limited only to your line art. My personal favorite line art coloring technique is to leave the outermost edge of my characters as dark as possible, and only focus on coloring the innermost lines. This adds contrast between the characters and the backgrounds, but still gives some extra nuance to them. Those are the basics for how you can create a comic style test in Clip Studio Paint. In the next video, I'll be covering some ways to experiment with color and rendering for a comic style test. Check the description below for my social media links and more tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.
Clip Studio Paint.